Hey everyone, welcome to Dark Dossier. Before we dive into the video, comment your city down below. I wanna see where you're all tuning in from. And don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe so you never miss out. Let's get started. Story 1. The Goose That Solved a Medieval Market Robbery. The year was 1386, and the town of Chelmno, a modest trading hub along the Vistula River in what is now northern Poland, was alive with the noise of its weekly market. Merchants laid out bolts of cloth from Flanders, salted fish from the Baltic coast, and barrels of honey mead. Local farmers brought in their wares: onions tied in knotted braids, rye bread baked in wood-fired ovens, and geese fattened for the coming winter. The smell of animal dung mingled with roasting chestnuts, creating a pungent, earthy atmosphere that was both unpleasant and reassuringly familiar to the townsfolk. The medieval market was more than just a place of trade. It was the beating heart of the community. It was here that contracts were made, alliances formed, gossip exchanged, and justice, in its peculiar medieval fashion, often played out. But on this particular day, a crime disrupted the hum of ordinary business. The chest of a wealthy merchant was stolen, its contents vanishing as if swallowed by the air. The merchant and his fortune. The victim was a man named Jacob the Elder, a cloth merchant who had made his fortune importing dyed fabrics from Bruges. To display his wealth and attract customers, Jacob often traveled with a large wooden chest reinforced by iron bands. It was not unusual for traders to carry significant sums of money in such chests: gold florins, silver groats, even promissory notes, and Jacob, whose reputation was tied to the visibility of his affluence, had made the mistake of keeping his chest close to his stall in the marketplace. Witnesses later recalled that Jacob's stall was especially busy that day. He had brought a shipment of fine crimson cloth, a color reserved for the wealthy and powerful, often clergy or nobles. The crowd was thick, and Jacob's voice boomed as he boasted of the dye's origin and the superiority of his stock. Yet in the confusion, while the crowd pressed around his goods, the chest itself slipped out of sight. When Jacob turned at midday to collect payment from his customers, his heart nearly stopped. The chest, heavy enough to require at least 2 men to move, was gone. The panic of the theft. The disappearance caused an immediate stir. Merchants shouted for the town watch, peasants craned their necks to see what had happened, and Jacob, his face pale beneath his graying beard, demanded justice. But in a bustling medieval marketplace, justice was rarely straightforward. Dozens of strangers were present, many coming from outlying villages. The watch, poorly trained and often bribed, was reluctant to intervene without clear direction. Suspicion spread quickly, first toward vagrants and traveling peddlers, then toward rival merchants who might have wished to ruin Jacob's standing. One name surfaced quickly: a journeyman named Otto, who had been seen loitering near Jacob's stall earlier in the morning. Otto was a leather worker, known more for his drinking than his craftsmanship, and he had been dismissed from an apprenticeship weeks before. Some claimed to have seen him near the chest, but others were less certain. The watch seized Otto, who protested his innocence, insisting he had only come to admire the cloth. Yet the absence of the chest made suspicion stick to him like mud. Trial by noise. In medieval towns, evidence was often thin, and justice leaned heavily on communal testimony and symbolism. Jacob insisted that Otto be tried immediately, as delay might allow the true thief to escape. The watch dragged Otto into the square, where the crowd gathered for what amounted to a public spectacle. In those days, courts did not rely solely on physical evidence. They invoked ordeal, confession, or sometimes the voice of the crowd itself. Otto denied the crime, swearing on the relics of St. Barbara at the local chapel that he was innocent. His denial, however, carried little weight against Jacob's wealth and reputation. And yet, just as Otto seemed destined for punishment, something unusual occurred. The goose. Among Jacob's wares was not only cloth, but also a plump white goose he had purchased that morning, tied by its leg to the stall. This goose, restless in the commotion, honked loudly each time Otto was brought near. Some in the crowd laughed, saying the bird was crying out at the sight of a thief. Others murmured more seriously, for animals were sometimes thought to possess an uncanny sense of truth. Dogs were used to sniff out criminals. Cats were seen as omens. Geese, with their sharp eyes and loud cries, were regarded as natural sentinels. The watch captain, half amused and half desperate for direction, ordered Otto to be led around the marketplace while the goose was carried after him. Each time the accused came within a few paces, the bird erupted in furious squawking. "Behold the justice of God," shouted Jacob, pointing to the animal as proof. The crowd, swayed by the performance, roared its approval. Otto, now pale and sweating, begged for mercy, but the goose's cries grew louder still. Some said the bird had seen the theft, others that divine providence was speaking through its voice. In the strange logic of the time, it was decided that Otto must be guilty. The turning of suspicion. And yet, just when Jacob prepared to demand Otto's punishment, another man in the crowd raised his voice. He was a butcher named Anselm, known for his sharp tongue and unwillingness to flatter the wealthy. He reminded those present that Jacob himself had owned the goose, and perhaps the bird was reacting to its master's anxiety rather than any crime. "If the goose is such a wise judge," Anselm declared, "let it be shown what it points to when set free." The crowd murmured. Some laughed at the absurdity, others were curious. Jacob protested he did not wish to risk losing his prized bird, but the watch, eager to avoid rash judgment, allowed it. The rope around the goose's leg was untied. The bird flapped its wings, honked furiously, and waddled into the marketplace. And then, to everyone's surprise, the goose did not chase Otto. Instead, it darted straight toward a cart piled with hay near the edge of the square. With frantic pecking and flapping, it circled the cart and honked as though announcing something hidden. When the hay was pulled aside, the crowd gasped. Beneath the straw lay Jacob's iron-banded chest. Confusion and silence. The revelation stunned the marketplace. Otto, who had been moments from condemnation, burst into tears of relief. Jacob, humiliated, tried to explain that perhaps Otto had hidden the chest there earlier, intending to retrieve it later. But the goose, standing proudly atop the chest, seemed to mock him with its triumphant squawking. The watch now faced an uncomfortable dilemma. If Otto was not the thief, who was? Some began whispering that Jacob himself might have staged the theft to gain sympathy, increase his reputation for wealth, or even to claim damages from the town. Such accusations were dangerous, but once spoken, they spread like wildfire. The marketplace, once so sure of Otto's guilt, now simmered with uncertainty. Jacob, once the victim, now found himself under suspicion. The goose, in its simplicity, had overturned the certainty of the crowd. An unresolved question. The chest was recovered, but no thief was caught. Otto was released, though his reputation remained stained by the ordeal. Jacob's authority as a wealthy merchant was shaken, and some of his rivals took advantage, spreading whispers that he had sought to trick the town. As for the goose, it became something of a legend in Chelmno. Some claimed it had been guided by divine providence, others that it merely smelled the grain dust left on the chest. Yet the real mystery lingered. If Otto was not the thief, then who had risked stealing a chest in the middle of a crowded market, and why had they chosen to abandon it so clumsily? The market of Chelmno returned to its rhythm in the days following the goose's curious performance, but the theft had left a fracture in the town's trust. The iron-banded chest, though recovered, carried with it a lingering unease. Merchants worried about the safety of their wares, peasants whispered about divine geese, and the town watch found themselves embarrassed at how close they had come to condemning an innocent man. The thief had slipped into the crowd like smoke. The question was whether he or she still walked among the townsfolk, waiting for another chance. The watch investigates. The watch, under pressure from the town council, began questioning those present during the theft. Their methods were crude, often little more than intimidation and rumor gathering. They started with Otto, who, despite being freed, remained under suspicion in the eyes of many. His reputation as a drunkard worked against him. Why should we believe he did not simply move the chest, then panic when the goose revealed it? Some muttered. But Otto had one thing in his favor. Witnesses recalled seeing him at the tavern shortly after the theft, drunk and belligerent, but with no chest in his possession. It would have been nearly impossible for him to stash the chest and then appear so quickly among the drinkers. Still, suspicion lingered because in medieval towns, once accused, a man was rarely free of shadow. The watch expanded their inquiries. They spoke with Anselm the butcher, who had cleverly pointed out the flaw in Jakob's goose testimony. He, too, fell under suspicion briefly, for his boldness seemed almost too convenient, as if he had sought to draw attention away from himself. But the butcher's cart had been busy throughout the morning, and several customers vouched for him. So the watch turned elsewhere, probing the quiet corners of the market's memory. Rivals and enemies. Jakob the Elder, like many successful merchants, had no shortage of rivals. Cloth trading was a lucrative but cutthroat business. Prices were manipulated, dye sources were guarded like state secrets, and competitors spread false rumors to tarnish reputations. One rival in particular, a man named Matthias, came quickly under suspicion. Matthias was a younger merchant, envious of Jakob's wealth and known for sharp dealings. On the morning of the theft, his stall had been placed only a few rows away. Witnesses claimed they saw him glance repeatedly at Jakob's chest, his eyes lingering too long. Others said Matthias left his stall unattended for nearly half an hour, time enough to orchestrate a theft. When questioned, Matthias dismissed the accusations as slander, insisting he had only stepped away to fetch a delivery of wool from a carter at the gate. Conveniently, the carter could not be located to confirm his story. The lack of corroboration deepened suspicion, but no proof tied Matthias to the chest beneath the hay. Still, the rumor stuck. In the days that followed, Matthias's sales dropped. Customers, wary of doing business with someone suspected of theft, kept their distance. And Jakob, while relieved to see his rival under suspicion, found little solace because he himself was now the target of gossip. The whispers about Jakob. It is a curious truth of medieval markets that the wealthier a man appeared, the more suspicion he attracted in times of crisis. Jakob had long been admired for his imported cloths, but also resented for his arrogance. He treated lesser merchants with disdain, drove hard bargains, and flaunted his wealth. When the goose had revealed the chest hidden beneath the hay, some took it as a sign of Jakob's duplicity. Perhaps, they whispered, Jakob had arranged the theft himself, hoping to cast blame on Otto or another rival. By making himself the victim, he could rally sympathy and reaffirm his status as a man too important to cross. This theory was not without precedent. In medieval towns, merchants sometimes staged robberies to manipulate prices or force the council to grant them favors. If Jakob could persuade the town that his wealth was under threat, he might demand stronger protection for merchants, thereby cementing his influence. Jakob, of course, denied such claims with outrage. He demanded the watch clear his name, but the watch, hesitant to challenge public opinion, offered only vague assurances. The damage was already done. Jakob's reputation had shifted from respected merchant to suspected schemer. The role of the goose. While human suspects tangled in rumor and suspicion, the goose became a celebrity in Chelmno. Children followed it in the streets, calling it the judge. Some townsfolk brought it offerings of grain, believing it had been touched by divine will. Others scoffed, calling it nonsense, yet even skeptics admitted the bird's cries had saved Otto from injustice. Animals had long been entwined with medieval justice. Dogs were sometimes placed in trials, believed to sense guilt or innocence. Pigs and even horses had been put on trial for crimes ranging from theft to violence. In this context, The goose's behavior fit easily into the worldview of the time. But for the watch, the goose presented a problem. If its cries had been considered valid testimony once, why should they not be used again? Some townsfolk suggested parading all suspects before the bird and letting it choose the guilty party. The watch captain, embarrassed by the idea, resisted, but the murmurs persisted. And in a way, the goose's reputation overshadowed the human investigation. While the watch struggled with inconsistent witness accounts, the people of Chelmno were already convinced. If the goose had not pointed to Otto, then Otto must be innocent. If it had not pointed to Jakob, then perhaps Jakob was not guilty either. This left a troubling question: had the goose revealed all there was to know, or had it simply distracted the town from a clever thief still at large? A lead emerges. Nearly 2 weeks after the theft, a new thread surfaced. A carter newly arrived in town claimed he had seen 2 strangers near the hay cart on the morning of the market. They were not locals, he insisted, but travelers, perhaps thieves who had slipped into town with the merchants and peasants. He described them as rough-looking, one tall and thin, the other stocky, both wearing cloaks with hoods pulled low. The watch seized on this testimony eagerly. If the theft had been the work of outsiders, then the town could absolve itself of suspicion. Jakob could blame foreigners, Matthias could be freed of rumor, and Otto could be quietly forgotten. But there was a problem. No one else remembered seeing these supposed strangers. The carter himself was vague about details, unable to describe their faces. Still, the watch captain announced that the investigation would continue along this line. Notices were sent to nearby towns, describing the chest and its brief disappearance. The council even offered a small reward for information leading to the capture of the thieves, but no reply came. The town grows restless. As weeks passed, the case became less about the stolen chest and more about the reputations entangled in it. Otto continued to protest his innocence, but found himself shunned by employers who feared the stain of suspicion. Matthias lost customers, but gained sympathy from other merchants who saw in Jakob's accusations a sign of arrogance. Jakob himself, though wealthier than most, became increasingly isolated, his stall no longer the center of admiration but of whispers. The goose, oddly enough, was the only one to gain from the affair. Jakob, perhaps realizing the bird's popularity could soften public opinion, began bringing it to the market each week. Children laughed as it waddled among the stalls, and customers found its presence oddly reassuring. Some joked that Jakob had found a new business partner more reliable than any human apprentice. Yet beneath the humor lay an unresolved tension. The chest had been hidden, not stolen away. Someone had risked much to move it in plain sight of dozens, then abandoned it. Was the thief interrupted? Was it a failed attempt to ruin Jakob's reputation? Or was it part of a larger scheme that had yet to unfold? An unsettling twist. The uneasy calm broke when, one cold morning, a second theft occurred. This time, the victim was not Jakob but a spice merchant from Gdansk. His stall was found ransacked, with several sacks of peppercorns missing. The theft had been swift and silent, occurring during the busiest hour of the market. Once again, the watch scrambled. And once again, whispers began. Some insisted it was the same thief or thieves who had taken Jakob's chest. Others claimed it was proof that Chelmno's market had become a hunting ground for outsiders. Still others, more cynically, wondered whether Jakob himself was behind it all, orchestrating chaos to distract from his own dealings. As suspicion spread, one thought haunted the market square. If the goose had revealed the truth once, could it do so again, and would the town dare to trust a bird over men of standing? The theft of the spice merchant's goods marked a turning point for the town of Chelmno. What had begun as a single, embarrassing incident for Jakob the Elder was now threatening to become a pattern, a reputation-destroying blemish on the town's weekly market. Peppercorns were worth their weight in silver, and the loss stung deeply. More than a single merchant's livelihood was at stake. Chelmno's credibility as a trading hub now hung in the balance. The council convened, summoning the watch, prominent merchants, and clergy. For hours they debated whether the thefts were the work of locals, jealous rivals, or traveling criminals. The only certainty was that if the crimes were not resolved, fewer traders would risk the journey to Chelmno. And in medieval towns, reputation was everything. The Goose returns to the stage. Though the watch resisted, many townsfolk once again demanded the Goose be involved. After all, it had solved the first theft, however oddly. The spice merchant himself, desperate for answers, agreed. So on the next market day, amid a gathering crowd, the Goose was brought once more into the square. Jakob, perhaps enjoying the renewed attention, paraded the bird before the stalls. Suspects were named: Otto again, Matthias, even Anselm the butcher. Each was marched past the Goose, and though it honked occasionally as any goose would, it offered no decisive outburst. The crowd grew restless. Then, as the watch attempted to lead the bird away, it broke free of Jakob's grip and made for the spice merchant's stall. Flapping, honking, and pecking furiously, it darted behind a stack of crates where two young apprentices crouched, attempting to look invisible. The crowd erupted. The apprentices, brothers from a nearby village, were dragged forward. At first they denied everything, swearing innocence. But the watch, emboldened by the Goose's display and pressured by the furious spice merchant, pressed hard. Under questioning and with threats of punishment, they confessed. The confession. The brothers admitted to the pepper theft and, more shockingly, to moving Jakob's chest weeks earlier. They had not intended to steal it permanently, they said, but to hide it as a prank, hoping to humiliate the boastful merchant. When the Goose revealed the chest, they panicked and stayed silent, fearing retribution. Emboldened by their success in causing chaos, they had later targeted the spice merchant's stall, this time with the intent to profit. The confession relieved many, but not all. Some wondered if the apprentices had been scapegoated, coerced into confession. Others argued it was too convenient that two poor boys took the blame while wealthier suspects were quietly excused. But the town council was eager for resolution. A culprit had been named, the crimes explained, and Chelmno's market could salvage its dignity. Punishment and spectacle. In accordance with town law, the apprentices were sentenced to public punishment. Theft of such magnitude, even by youths, could warrant execution, but their age and the absence of lasting loss in Jakob's case tempered the judgment. Instead, they were flogged in the market square and banished from Chelmno. The punishment served its purpose. It reassured merchants that justice had been delivered. The watch paraded the Goose alongside the council members, declaring it a creature chosen by Providence to reveal what men conceal. Jakob, ever the opportunist, leaned into the spectacle. He allowed the Goose to become part of his market display, drawing customers who wanted to see the bird that had solved two crimes. The irony was not lost on his rivals. The very event that had nearly ruined him now became a tool for profit. A community divided. Not everyone was convinced. Some townsfolk whispered that Matthias, Jakob's rival, had cleverly avoided deeper scrutiny. Others noted that the apprentice's confession came only after hours of harsh interrogation. Who could say if it was truth or desperation? Still, medieval justice often prized closure over certainty. The council declared the matter resolved, and the market continued. Yet beneath the surface, the affair left scars. Otto the journeyman never shed the taint of suspicion, leaving Chelmno for another town. Matthias's reputation slowly recovered, though he remained wary of Jakob's influence. And Jakob himself, though wealthier than before, carried the uneasy knowledge that many still wondered if he had somehow orchestrated the chaos. Reflection, a goose and a lesson. The tale of the goose that solved a robbery endured long after the apprentices were forgotten. Chroniclers and storytellers repeated it as proof that animals sometimes revealed God's will. Children laughed at the idea of a bird outwitting thieves, while merchants took a quieter lesson, that in a crowded marketplace, truth is fragile, and reputation can be as valuable and as vulnerable as gold. For historians, the case is less about divine birds and more about the peculiarities of medieval justice. Evidence mattered little compared to performance, rumor, and spectacle. The goose became credible not because of logic, but because the crowd wanted a sign, and in its honks they found one. And so the story ends, not with certainty about guilt, but with a reflection. Was justice truly served in Chelmno? Or did the town merely choose the easiest resolution to preserve its fragile order? Story 2. The Locksmith of Bologna, a key to too many doors. The city of Bologna in the early 15th century was alive with energy. Its university, the oldest in Europe, drew scholars from across the continent, while merchants filled the piazzas with stalls selling wool, grain, olive oil, and spices. But beneath its scholarly reputation and bustling commerce lay another Bologna, a city of factional rivalries, dark alleys, and secrets locked away behind thick oak doors. In this world, few trades were as quietly powerful as that of the locksmith. A locksmith of reputation. The man at the center of this story was Bartolomeo di Rossi, a locksmith whose reputation spread far beyond Bologna's walls. Known for his steady hands and intricate craftsmanship, Bartolomeo was trusted by merchants, priests, and noblemen alike. He forged keys not only for homes and shops but for treasure chests, reliquaries, and guild halls. In a time when locks were not yet standardized, every mechanism bore the imprint of its maker. Each was unique, a puzzle of pins, wards, and tumblers. Bartolomeo's locks were renowned for their complexity. He often boasted that no man alive could pick them. His customers, proud of their wealth, displayed his work as both a safeguard and a status symbol. But trust is a fragile thing. The more doors Bartolomeo secured, the more suspicion gathered in whispers. If he could make locks, could he not also unmake them? A string of curious thefts. The story begins in the autumn of 1412, when a series of quiet but costly thefts unsettled Bologna's wealthiest citizens. A jeweler reported pearls missing from his strongbox. A guild master claimed that guild funds vanished from a chest locked with Bartolomeo's mechanism. A wealthy widow awoke to find her silver candlesticks gone, her shutters still latched from within. What tied the crimes together was their strangeness. There were no signs of forced entry, no doors splintered, no locks broken. Instead, it seemed the thief simply walked in and out as if holding the proper key. The victims, embarrassed by their vulnerability, turned first to Bartolomeo himself, demanding explanations. He examined the locks, tested the keys, and declared them intact. If anything, he argued, the crimes proved the necessity of better locks, but the murmurs began nonetheless. Who else but the locksmith could possess such intimate knowledge of every mechanism in Bologna? Trust and doubt. To understand the weight of these suspicions, you must picture the role of the locksmith in medieval society. In an age without safes or police forces, a lock was often the final barrier between a family and ruin. A chest of coins, a document of inheritance, or a dowry all depended on the honesty of the man who forged the key. Bartolomeo's position was one of both power and peril. He moved between households, privy to their secrets. He learned who stored money beneath floorboards, who hid jewels in wall niches, who feared rivals or bandits. In a city divided by factional strife between the papal loyalists and communal partisans, such knowledge was dangerous. And now, with each theft, the circle of trust narrowed. The council steps in. By winter, the thefts grew too many to ignore. Bologna's ruling council, fearing unrest among merchants, summoned Bartolomeo for questioning. They demanded to know how thieves could bypass locks of his design. The locksmith stood in the Palazzo del Podesta, surrounded by stern faces. He swore his innocence, insisting his craft was sound. "A lock is faithful," he declared, "if the hand that holds its key is faithful." In other words, perhaps the keys themselves had been copied or betrayed by servants. The council was unconvinced. They pressed him further, asking if he kept copies of keys. Bartolomeo denied it, but his hesitation fueled suspicion. In truth, locksmiths often retained impressions or sketches, sometimes for repairs, sometimes for insurance. Whether Bartolomeo did so out of habit or design, no one could say. To calm the growing unrest, the council ordered him to cease work temporarily. His shop was closed, his apprentices dismissed. But even as Bartolomeo protested, more thefts occurred. A new pattern emerges. With Bartolomeo under scrutiny, one might expect the thefts to stop. Instead, they grew bolder. A spice trader's warehouse was emptied in a single night. The treasury of a minor guild was rifled, leaving only the smallest coins behind. Most shocking of all, a reliquary in a church was opened, its gilded casing untouched, its relic of Saint Petronia stolen. Panic spread. If holy relics could be taken without a mark of violence, what safety remained for common men? Some whispered of sorcery, that the thief used charms to lull locks asleep. Others returned to the simplest explanation. Bartolomeo himself, freed from suspicion by the council's watchful eye, must have orchestrated the thefts through hidden agents. Bartolomeo, furious, demanded a chance to prove his innocence. He insisted the thefts were the work of a rival craftsman, someone who had studied his designs and found their weaknesses. He named no names, but many knew of a former apprentice, Pietro, who had left his service under bitter terms. Pietro the apprentice. Pietro di Malvesi had once been Bartolomeo's most gifted student, but his ambition clashed with his master's pride. After an argument over wages and recognition, Pietro departed and opened his own small workshop on the outskirts of the city. His work was less refined, his clients fewer, but he was clever and resourceful. Could Pietro have been the thief? Bartolomeo believed so. He told the council that only someone who had studied his methods closely could so deftly mimic or subvert his locks. Pietro, in his bitterness, had both the skill and the motive. When summoned, Pietro denied everything. He admitted resentment toward Bartolomeo but swore he had no part in the thefts. Still, when pressed, he revealed a crucial detail. Bartolomeo, he claimed, had a habit of making wax impressions of keys before handing them to clients. Pietro suggested his master kept a hidden collection, a library of access to Bologna's wealth. The accusation stunned the council. If true, Bartolomeo was not merely negligent, he was a criminal mastermind. But Pietro had no proof, only his word. A test of locks. To resolve the impasse, the council devised a test. They presented Bartolomeo with a sealed chest, locked with a mechanism of Pietro's design. He was to open it within the hall, under watchful eyes. If he succeeded, it would prove his unrivaled skill but also hint at how the mysterious thief could bypass locks at will. Bartolomeo accepted, his pride at stake. Before the gathered council and merchants, he examined the lock, traced its wards with delicate tools, and within minutes produced a soft click. The chest opened. Gasps filled the hall. Triumphant, Bartolomeo argued this proved nothing against him. Any skilled locksmith could open a lock with time and tools, he said. But the council was unsettled. If locks were so easily undone, then who could be trusted at all? An unresolved question. The test deepened the mystery rather than resolved it. Was Bartolomeo demonstrating innocent skill or revealing precisely how the thief operated? Pietro's accusations lingered. Bartolomeo's denials grew louder. The citizens of Bologna, meanwhile, locked their doors with trembling hands, wondering whether any barrier truly stood between them and the shadow that walked unseen. And as winter turned to spring, the thefts continued. Was Bartolomeo the guardian of Bologna's safety, or the very man who had learned to slip every bolt and latch in the city? The thefts that plagued Bologna in the early 1400s were no longer seen as isolated incidents. With the reliquary of Saint Petronia stolen, the matter crossed from personal property to sacrilege. shaking the city's faith as much as its commerce. Bologna's council faced rising anger from guilds, merchants, and clergy. In a city built on trust between craftsmen and clients, every missing coin, every vanished jewel, every rifled chest whispered the same fear. The locksmith holds the keys to all our lives. Pietro and Bartolomeo, the rivalry intensifies. The accusations between Bartolomeo di Rossi and his former apprentice Pietro di Malvesi took on the weight of a duel. Bartolomeo was proud, indignant, his livelihood at stake. Pietro was cunning, ambitious, eager to prove himself more than a cast-off student. Each insisted the other must be the thief or the mastermind behind them. The council, split by factional politics, struggled to judge. Some sided with Bartolomeo, whose locks still guarded their wealth. Others, mistrustful of his influence, saw Pietro as a truth-teller exposing his master's corruption. The rivalry turned the investigation into theater. On market days, gossip flowed as freely as wine. Pietro accusing Bartolomeo of hoarding wax impressions of keys, Bartolomeo sneering that Pietro lacked the skill to open even a stable door. The thefts themselves became secondary to the spectacle of their feud. The victims' voices. Meanwhile, the victims pressed harder for justice. The jeweler who had lost pearls demanded compensation, declaring he would no longer use Bartolomeo's locks. The widow whose candlesticks had been taken stood in the piazza, weeping publicly and insisting that thieves could only have entered with a true key. But the most vocal was the prior of the church that had lost St. Petronius's relic. He thundered from the pulpit that the theft was an insult to God, and that Bologna risked divine punishment if the culprit was not found. The relic was not merely a trinket, it was a source of protection, believed to guard the city itself. Without it, Bologna's very soul felt violated. The council had no choice but to act more aggressively. A search for the hidden keys. Spurred by Pietro's accusations, the watch raided Bartolomeo's workshop. They rifled through chests, examined tools, and pried up floorboards. To the locksmith's horror, they discovered a small collection of wax impressions and spare keys. Bartolomeo defended himself. The impressions, he argued, were part of legitimate work made to repair locks or provide replacements. No stolen goods were found. No evidence tied him directly to the crimes. Still, the sight of those wax molds chilled the council. They saw in them the possibility that Bartolomeo, or someone with access to his shop, held the means to enter any door in Bologna. The discovery deepened suspicion, but failed to resolve guilt. Was Bartolomeo the thief, or merely a craftsman whose methods had been exploited by another? A mysterious figure in the shadows. Then came a new twist. One night, a watchman patrolling the northern quarter spotted a cloaked figure slipping into a merchant's courtyard. When challenged, the figure vanished over a wall, leaving behind a small set of delicate tools, slender picks, a file, and a fragment of wax with the impression of a key. The tools were shown to Bartolomeo. He admitted they were of his craft but denied ownership. Pietro, for his part, smirked and suggested the tools could only have been forged by a master hand, either Bartolomeo himself or someone trained by him. For the council, the mystery only thickened. If the thief was not Bartolomeo, perhaps it was one of his many apprentices, men trained, dismissed, or wandering Bologna with his secrets in hand. The thought chilled them. Had the locksmith, in teaching his craft, created an entire generation of potential criminals? A trap is set. Desperate, the council devised a plan. They placed a decoy chest in a guild hall, filled with coins but marked secretly with dies and seals. A handful of men were stationed nearby, concealed in shadows, instructed to seize anyone who tampered with the lock. Weeks passed with no incident. Then, on a damp spring night, the trap was sprung. A figure crept into the hall, tools in hand, and worked the lock with eerie confidence. Just as the chest gave way, the watchman pounced. The thief was no stranger. It was not Bartolomeo nor Pietro, but one of Bartolomeo's former apprentices, a young man named Giulio. He confessed quickly under interrogation, explaining that he had learned his master's techniques, made his own impressions of keys, and built a life of theft in the shadows. But Giulio's confession raised more questions than it answered. The stolen relic. When pressed about the relic of St. Petronius, Giulio swore he had never touched it. He admitted to jewels, coins, and spices, but denied any role in the church theft. If he spoke true, then someone else had carried out the most sacrilegious act of all. The council seized on his guilt nonetheless, eager for closure. Giulio was paraded through Bologna, condemned for his crimes and executed publicly. But the whispers remained. If Giulio had not stolen the relic, then who had? Bartolomeo seized the moment to claim vindication. He argued that Giulio had betrayed his training, staining the honor of the locksmith's craft. Pietro countered that Bartolomeo bore responsibility for teaching him in the first place. The feud deepened, each man hurling accusations while the relic remained missing. Public doubt and growing fear. The people of Bologna grew restless. Giulio's execution brought no relic, no restitution, no true sense of safety. Bartolomeo's shop remained closed, yet thefts smaller now, less ambitious, still flickered through the city. Some citizens began installing double locks, chaining doors, or hearing guards. Others whispered of sorcery again, convinced no human hand could walk so freely through their defenses. The line between superstition and reason blurred, as it often did in medieval towns when fear outpaced truth. And above it all loomed the unanswered question. If Giulio was not the thief of the relic, then who had dared to strike at the very heart of Bologna's faith? And was the true mastermind still walking free among them? The execution of Giulio the apprentice calmed Bologna only briefly. His confession satisfied the council's need for a culprit, but in taverns and marketplaces, the same doubts rippled through conversations. What of the relic? If the saint's bones had truly been taken, then the city remained vulnerable not only to theft but to divine judgment. The reliquary's desecration weighed heavily on the clergy and in turn on the people. Without the relic of St. Petronius, Bologna's protector, the faithful wondered if their city might suffer misfortune. It was not enough to punish an apprentice thief. The sacred theft demanded a deeper truth. Pietro's counteraccusation. With Giulio dead, suspicion returned to Bartolomeo. Pietro, his rival, pressed the matter with renewed vigor. He stood before the council and argued that Giulio had only been a pawn. Who taught him? Who supplied him with impressions and tools? Who profited when the locks of Bologna were distrusted, so that only he could replace them? The implication was clear. Pietro believed Bartolomeo had orchestrated Giulio's crimes while keeping his own hands clean. To Pietro, the theft of the relic bore the hallmarks of pride, not greed. Only a man eager to prove himself superior to all barriers would dare open a reliquary untouched by violence. Bartolomeo, furious, demanded a hearing of his own. He pointed to Pietro's ambition and bitterness as motive. Who gains, he asked, if I am ruined? Who hungers to inherit my customers, my trade, my name? The council, caught between two men whose enmity was poisoning the city, ordered one final inquiry. A merchant's testimony. The turning point came unexpectedly, through the testimony of a spice merchant. He recalled seeing Pietro speaking late at night with Giulio months before the apprentice's arrest. Their meeting, hushed and hurried, took place in an alley near the merchant's storehouse, one that had later been robbed. Confronted with this, Pietro faltered. He admitted to meeting Giulio but claimed he had only warned him against disloyalty to Bartolomeo. Few believed him. The coincidence was too sharp, the timing too suspicious. The council ordered Pietro's workshop searched. There, hidden beneath floorboards, they found a small box. Inside lay several stolen trinkets, rings, coins, and, most damning of all, a fragment of gilded casing unmistakably torn from the reliquary of St. Petronius. The resolution. The discovery sealed Pietro's fate. He was arrested, tried swiftly, and condemned. Unlike Giulio, his punishment carried greater weight. Theft of a relic was sacrilege, and sacrilege demanded severity. Pietro was executed outside the city gates, his body left hanging as a warning that Bologna's locks might be breached, but not its faith. Bartolomeo was restored to his workshop, his reputation bruised but officially cleared. The council declared him innocent, insisting the thefts had been the work of a traitorous apprentice and a jealous rival. He returned to his craft, but the shadow of suspicion never fully left him. Many merchants continued to glance at him warily, wondering whether Pietro had truly acted alone or whether the master locksmith had simply been too clever to be caught. The aftermath in Bologna. The relic was restored to its reliquary, though whispers lingered that its sanctity had been tainted. The people celebrated its return with processions and prayers, seeking to heal the wound left by its absence. Locks, meanwhile, gained a new symbolic meaning. They were no longer seen as absolute barriers, but as fragile promises strong only as the honesty of the man who forged them. Some merchants began demanding that two locksmiths, not one, oversee important mechanisms, believing rivalry could keep corruption in check. Others hired guards, shifting trust from craft to muscle. As for Bartolomeo, he worked until old age, his hands steady but his pride diminished. To the end of his days, he swore that Pietro had framed him, that he had never abused the secrets of his craft. But among the citizens of Bologna, the story became a cautionary tale. Reflection, the key and the hand that holds it. The locksmith of Bologna's tale is less about locks than about trust. A lock, after all, is only as honest as the man who shapes it and the man who holds its key. Bartolomeo built the barriers that protected Bologna, but suspicion clung to him because he alone understood how easily those barriers could fall. Was he guilty, an accomplice hidden behind apprentices and rivals? Or was he truly innocent, a craftsman undone by the very knowledge that made him indispensable? History leaves the question unresolved, for records tell only of Pietro's execution and Bartolomeo's return to work. But the people of Bologna remembered the lesson in simpler terms. No door is ever truly closed when too many hands know how to shape the key. Story 3. The Whispering Banknotes of 19th Century London. London in the 1820s was a city swelling with contradictions. Gas lamps illuminated its wealthier districts, while soot-blackened alleys hid the desperate poor. Omnibuses rattled past shops glittering with imported goods, while beggars clung to the edges of bridges. At its heart, the Bank of England projected stability, a fortress of finance that issued the very notes upon which the empire's trade relied. Yet even in this bastion of respectability, whispers began to spread. Merchants who took banknotes in exchange for goods swore that some of them spoke not with sound, but with silence. Notes that looked genuine, felt genuine, passed through hands as though real, and then, weeks later, were exposed as clever forgeries. The crime was not one of knives or pistols. It was quieter, more insidious. It was the crime of counterfeit. A city of paper wealth. Britain had long relied on gold and silver coinage, but with the Napoleonic Wars straining the treasury, paper banknotes became more common. These notes, printed by the Bank of England, were promises rather than coins, promises to pay the bearer in gold. For the working man, they were mysterious slips of paper. For merchants, they were both convenience and risk. Forgery was a constant danger. Each year, courts hanged dozens for passing false notes, sometimes even when the accused claimed ignorance. The gallows at Newgate saw printers, peddlers, and poor widows alike swing for the crime. To forge money was to challenge the crown itself. By the 1820s, the bank's printing methods had improved, but not enough. Skilled engravers could mimic designs, ink, and paper. And in the teeming neighborhoods around Clerkenwell and Holborn, whispers told of workshops hidden in attics where counterfeit notes were printed in the dead of night. The case of the disappearing gold. The scandal that brought the issue to light began with a merchant named Samuel Weatherby. He ran a drapery shop in Holborn, dealing in linens and cloth. One autumn morning, he received payment in several crisp £1 notes from a young gentleman buying fabric for suits. Weatherby, cautious, examined them carefully. They bore the watermark, the bank's seal, the correct numbering. Satisfied, he accepted them. Weeks later, when Weatherby deposited his earnings at the Bank of England, the clerk examined the notes and frowned. They were false, so expertly forged that even trained eyes could barely distinguish them. Weatherby was ruined. By law, he had no recourse. The bank did not reimburse victims of forgery. Word of his misfortune spread quickly among shopkeepers. If notes could be forged so perfectly, what value did they truly hold? Rumors swelled that London was awash in false paper, that entire trades could collapse if confidence was lost. Enter the detectives. At the time, the concept of detective work was only just emerging. The Bow Street runners, precursors to modern police, were tasked with investigating the forgeries. Among them was a man named George Ruthven, a runner with a reputation for persistence and guile. Ruthven knew that forgers operated not as individuals but as networks. Engravers, printers, paper suppliers, and distributors each played a part. To catch them, one needed patience, disguise, and above all, informants. Following whispers in taverns, Ruthven learned of a figure known only as the Whisperer. This man, it was said, never spoke above a hush and dealt only in counterfeit notes of the highest quality. His clients were pawnbrokers, gamblers, and petty thieves, men willing to risk their lives for easy money. The trail of the Whisperer. Ruthven's first break came when a pawnbroker in Southwark was caught with forged notes. Under threat of prison, he admitted he had purchased them from a man who met him near a riverside warehouse. The man wore gloves, spoke barely a word, and disappeared into the fog as if swallowed by the Thames. More reports followed. A publican in Whitechapel claimed to have seen bundles of notes exchanged in his back room. A printer in Clerkenwell swore he had been approached to supply specialized paper but had refused. Each clue pointed toward a carefully organized operation. Yet the Whisperer himself remained elusive. His forgeries were so convincing that some believed he had an inside connection at the Bank of England, perhaps even a rogue engraver or clerk. The thought that corruption might reach into the bank's fortress walls terrified London. The risk of silence. Meanwhile, ordinary shopkeepers lived in dread. To refuse a banknote was to lose trade. To accept it was to risk ruin. Weatherby's case was not unique. Others quietly went bankrupt, their honest work undone by paper illusions. The courts grew harsher, making examples of those caught passing false notes. In one infamous case, a seamstress named Mary Hobson was sentenced to death for unwittingly using a counterfeit to pay for bread. Her hanging shocked many but served as a grim reminder. Ignorance was no defense. The gallows whispered louder than the notes themselves. The public, however, began to murmur that executions punished the poor, while the true masters of forgery thrived unseen. The Whisperer became almost a legend, a ghost who could ruin lives with ink and silence. A lead in the fog. One damp evening in 1823, Ruthven received word from an informant. A man had been seen near Blackfriars Bridge, passing bundles of notes to a known gambler. The man's face was hidden by a scarf, but his voice, or rather his lack of it, marked him as unusual. He barely spoke, yet seemed to command obedience. Ruthven set a trap. Disguised as a dockworker, he lingered near the bridge for nights on end, watching the ebb and flow of London's underworld. And then, just past midnight, he saw him. A tall man in a dark coat, moving with the confidence of someone who feared nothing. his gloved hand slipping a package to another figure before disappearing into the mist. Ruthven followed but lost him in the warren of alleys. All that remained was the package, hastily discarded by the accomplice. Inside lay a bundle of notes so flawless that even Ruthven, trained to spot forgeries, struggled to tell truth from falsehood. The Whisperer was real, he was clever, and he was still free. An unresolved shadow. By now, fear spread faster than coins. The Bank of England tightened its printing methods, experimenting with more elaborate watermarks and engravings, but forgers adapted just as swiftly. Shopkeepers eyed every customer with suspicion, and some tradesmen demanded gold instead of paper. Still, the Whisperer remained a phantom. Some claimed he was a disgraced engraver. Others whispered he was a clerk within the bank itself, feeding designs to an underground press. A few believed he was not one man at all but a syndicate, hiding behind a single name. Ruthven knew only one thing for certain. Each forged note that slipped into circulation was not merely a crime, but an assault on London's fragile trust. And until the Whisperer was unmasked, every banknote in every hand carried the weight of doubt. If paper itself could no longer be trusted, what would happen to the city whose empire was built on trade, credit, and promise? By the winter of 1823, George Ruthven and the Bow Street runners were no longer merely investigating a string of counterfeits. They were caught in a duel of wits against an adversary who seemed to move as silently as the fog that curled along the Thames. The Whisperer, as London had begun to call him, was more than a forger. He was a specter who threatened the very faith on which commerce stood. The spread of fear. London's markets and shops became fraught with suspicion. Butchers at Smithfield refused notes from strangers, demanding coin instead. Pawnbrokers quietly tested each slip of paper against candlelight, tilting them for signs of false engraving. Even taverns began refusing larger notes, fearing ruin if the Bank of England declared them worthless. The bank itself grew defensive. Its clerks insisted the notes were secure, that no one could reproduce the watermark or engraving without inside access. Yet each week, another handful of flawless counterfeits reached their desks. The public's trust, once unshakable, now trembled. In Parliament, some whispered that too much reliance on paper currency was dangerous. Others defended it, claiming the forgers were few and would soon be caught. But outside Westminster, in the cramped alleys of London, faith was a currency harder to hold than gold. Ruthven's methods. Ruthven, unlike many of his peers, knew brute force alone could not solve the case. The Whisperer's network was careful, insulated by layers of intermediaries. Few ever saw the man himself. So Ruthven turned to infiltration. He sent informants into taverns frequented by pawnbrokers and gamblers, men who often tested the waters of counterfeit. He bribed printers for information on unusual orders of ink or paper. He even posed as a buyer himself, mingling with shady dealers in hopes of catching a whisper of the Whisperer's trail. One night, disguised as a sailor, Ruthven entered a tavern in Wapping. There he overheard two men boasting quietly of paper that could fool the devil himself. They spoke of a man with hands softer than a priest, who never raised his voice. Before Ruthven could intervene, the men slipped away. But the description chilled him. This was no common thug. This was someone educated, precise, an engraver by trade. The workshop in Clerkenwell. The first solid lead came through a printer's apprentice, who nervously confessed that he had been approached by a stranger offering high wages for unusual work. The job was simple, the man said. Create fine engravings, but never ask what they would be used for. The apprentice refused, frightened by the secrecy, but he remembered the address of a warehouse in Clerkenwell. Ruthven and a team of runners raided the warehouse at dawn. Inside, they found scraps of paper, chemical stains, and a printing press dismantled in haste. Whoever had worked there was gone, but the evidence was undeniable. This had been a forgery workshop. Among the debris lay a single note, half-printed, its watermark incomplete. It was so close to perfection that even unfinished it could have deceived an untrained eye. The runners also found something else, a ledger containing coded entries, names, dates, and quantities but written in a cipher. Ruthven pocketed it, certain it would lead to the Whisperer's suppliers and clients. The network revealed. Weeks of painstaking work followed. With the help of a scholar from the university, Ruthven began to unravel the ledger. The codes revealed payments to paper mills, shipments through river docks, and names of petty criminals already known to the runners. Piece by piece, a network emerged. Forged notes did not appear from nowhere. They flowed like water from a hidden spring. Paper was ordered in bulk under false names. Ink was mixed in small batches, carried across the city in sealed bottles. Couriers passed bundles through taverns and gambling dens. At the center of it all was a single symbol, a mark resembling a bird's feather, scrawled beside the largest transactions. Was this the Whisperer's signature, a silent boast? The double betrayal. The breakthrough came not from scholars or raids, but from betrayal. One of the Whisperer's own couriers, a man named Henry Fielding, no relation to the famous magistrate, was arrested for drunken brawling. Facing prison, he offered Ruthven a bargain, information in exchange for leniency. Fielding admitted he had delivered forged notes across the city. His instructions were always the same: meet a man at dusk near Blackfriars, receive a package, and distribute it. He never saw where the notes were printed, never heard more than a whisper. But he revealed something crucial. His last delivery had been disrupted when another courier, jealous of his earnings, reported him. The network was fraying from within. Ruthven seized the chance. He convinced Fielding to act as bait. They would arrange a meeting as usual, only this time Ruthven and the runners would be waiting. The man in gloves. On a foggy March evening, Fielding waited near Blackfriars Bridge, a satchel slung at his side. Ruthven and two runners lingered in the shadows. Minutes passed. Then a tall figure emerged, gloved hands carrying a bundle. He moved with quiet confidence, his scarf pulled high. Fielding handed over the satchel. The man nodded but said nothing. His silence was eerie, deliberate. Then, just as he turned, Ruthven sprang from the shadows. A struggle broke out. The man fought fiercely with surprising strength, but Ruthven's men overpowered him. When they tore away the scarf, gasps followed. The Whisperer was no anonymous engraver, no lowly thief. He was a man of standing, Edward Cartwright, a former clerk at the Bank of England itself. A clerk turned criminal. Cartwright had once been trusted with handling notes, tallying sums, and observing the bank's most guarded secrets. Quiet, meticulous, and overlooked by superiors, he had spent years studying the designs, the paper, the engravings. When dismissed for misconduct, he turned his knowledge into a weapon. It was Cartwright who had recruited engravers, bribed paper suppliers, and built a network that spread whispers across London. His silence, cultivated into an identity, had become legend. The arrest sent shockwaves through the city. That a clerk of the bank itself had betrayed his trust seemed worse than the counterfeits. It was proof that corruption could reach even into the fortress of England's wealth. An unresolved unease. Cartwright was tried swiftly, convicted, and sentenced to death. He faced the gallows at Newgate with the same silence he had carried through his crimes, refusing to confess or explain. His execution was meant to end the matter. But for London, unease lingered. The network he had built could not be destroyed with one man. Printers, couriers, and forgers still walked free. Notes continued to circulate, and merchants still squinted at each one, unsure whether it was truth or deception. The gallows silenced the Whisperer, but the whispers remained. If trust in money can be broken by ink and silence, how secure is the empire built upon it? The morning of Edward Cartwright's execution drew crowds to Newgate Prison. Londoners flocked not merely out of morbid curiosity, but from a hunger for reassurance. They wanted to see the end of the Whisperer, the man who had slipped counterfeit into their lives like a poison. The scaffold creaked under his weight. Cartwright, pale but composed, offered no last words. In keeping with his legend, he preserved his silence until the very end. The drop fell, and with it the man whose whispers had shaken London's faith in money. But while the execution satisfied the spectacle of justice, it did not resolve the deeper unease. The counterfeits continue. In the weeks that followed, forged notes still appeared in circulation. Some were cruder, easier to spot, but others bore the same unnerving perfection as Cartwright's work. Ruthven himself admitted in reports to the bank that Cartwright could not have acted entirely alone. His network was too wide, his forgeries too numerous. The dismantling of his workshop in Clerkenwell, and later a second hidden press near Southwark, revealed associates still at large. Engravers slipped away to the continent, carrying with them techniques honed under Cartwright's guidance. Couriers returned to crime, feeding the same underworld of pawnbrokers and gamblers. The Bank of England responded with stricter measures. Notes were redesigned with more elaborate engravings, intricate patterns meant to resist duplication. Watermarks grew more complex, but even as the bank innovated, the forgers adapted, and the cycle of deception continued. The public's distrust. For ordinary shopkeepers, trust in paper currency never fully recovered. Many insisted on coin, even when banknotes were legal tender. Some smaller tradesmen refused to handle notes at all, claiming they had no way to tell truth from falsehood. The harshness of the law only worsened fear. Dozens were hanged each year for uttering false notes, passing them in trade even when they swore ignorance. Women buying bread, laborers paying rent, children sent on errands, all faced the gallows if the slip of paper in their hands proved false. Critics began to argue that the bank itself bore responsibility. If its notes could be so easily forged, why should innocent citizens pay the price? Pamphlets circulated calling the executions unjust, the laws draconian. Public sympathy shifted not toward forgers, but toward the unlucky poor caught in their web. Ruthven's reflection. George Ruthven, who had hunted the Whisperer, continued his work with the Bow Street runners. In later accounts, he admitted the case had taught him a bitter truth. Crime was not always a matter of violence or greed in plain sight. Sometimes it was quiet, invisible, and all the more dangerous because it struck at the foundation of society's trust. He described money as the voice of a nation. If that voice could be forged, then every promise, every transaction, every bond of trade was vulnerable. The Whisperer had proved that silence could be louder than the clang of a thief's crowbar. The legacy of the Whisperer. Though Cartwright was gone, his legend endured. Among criminals, he was remembered as a genius who turned knowledge into power. Among merchants, he was a cautionary tale of misplaced trust. And in the Bank of England, his specter lingered for decades, driving innovations in currency design. The Whisperer's case marked a turning point. It forced Britain to treat forgery not merely as a nuisance, but as a national threat. Security printing became an art, intertwining with the growth of empire. Yet with every improvement came the same uneasy question: could perfection ever outpace deception? Reflection, paper trust and silence. The whispering banknotes of London remind us that crime does not always roar. Sometimes it whispers, passing from hand to hand unnoticed until lives collapse in its wake. Cartwright's silence on the gallows symbolized more than stubbornness. It was the silence of paper itself, neutral, blank, carrying promises that could be either truth or illusion. The citizens of London learned a hard lesson. Wealth was not measured in the weight of coins, but in the fragile trust that paper inspired. And so the story ends not with certainty, but with a question that still lingers in the world of finance. When money itself can be forged, what is it that truly holds value: the paper in your hand, or the belief that others will honor it? Story 4. The Counterfeit Wine of Bordeaux's Forgotten Vineyards. The Bordeaux region of France has long been synonymous with wine. By the mid-18th century, its reputation had spread across Europe, filling the cellars of aristocrats in Paris, London, and Vienna. A bottle of Bordeaux was not merely a drink. It was a mark of refinement, wealth, and trust in the soil and traditions of Aquitaine. But where there is prestige, there is opportunity for deception. The tale of Bordeaux's forgotten vineyards is one not of grand castles or noble vintners, but of counterfeit wines that whispered of elegance but carried a bitter truth. The Bordeaux boom. The 18th century brought a golden age for Bordeaux merchants. British demand soared after the Treaty of Utrecht, 1713, loosened trade restrictions, and ships carried barrels of claret down the Garonne and out to sea. The British upper classes drank it with gusto, praising its clarity and delicate taste. Merchants in Bordeaux thrived, and certain estates Château Lafite, Château Margaux became famous names, their wines commanding higher prices than lesser vintages. To own a cask from these vineyards was to possess a symbol of status. Yet this rising demand created a dangerous imbalance. There was not enough high-quality wine to meet the thirst of Europe's elites. Into this gap stepped fraud. The merchants of illusion. In the bustling port of Bordeaux, hundreds of negociants, wine merchants, bought and sold wines from growers across the region. Some were honest brokers, ensuring quality. Others, less scrupulous, saw profit in deception. These merchants began blending cheap wines from the hinterland's harsh, acidic vintages from Cahors or Gascony with small amounts of genuine Bordeaux. A splash of true claret could lend color and aroma, disguising the bulk of poor wine. Barrels were then branded with the names of prestigious estates. Seals were forged, papers falsified, and suddenly what had been swill for peasants became fine claret destined for noble tables. In London, aristocrats raised their glasses, toasting to Bordeaux's excellence, unaware they were drinking lies. The first suspicions. Whispers of fraud surfaced early. Some connoisseurs noted inconsistencies, wines that tasted too sharp, too heavy, or too thin to be genuine Bordeaux. A duke in England reportedly dismissed an entire shipment, declaring it the blood of Gascony, wearing the cloak of Bordeaux. Yet proving fraud was difficult. Wine varied naturally from year to year, and even experts could be deceived. Merchants in Bordeaux grew defensive, insisting their trade was honorable. Meanwhile, profits from counterfeit wine continued to flow. For the growers of genuine vineyards, however, the fraud was devastating. Their carefully cultivated reputations were diluted by impostors. A single bad cask could tarnish a name built over generations. The case of Château Saint-Pierre. One of the earliest documented scandals involved the modest but respected Château Saint-Pierre. Known for producing reliable vintages, it suddenly faced accusations from Dutch traders who claimed its barrels were adulterated. The Château's owner, furious, protested that his family had sent only pure wine. An investigation revealed that the fraud had not occurred at the Château, but at the port. Unscrupulous negociants had siphoned wine from Saint-Pierre's casks, replacing it with inferior blends before resealing the barrels. By the time the wine reached Amsterdam, it bore little resemblance to its origin. The scandal nearly ruined Saint-Pierre's reputation, and it became a warning to other estates. In the marketplace, even honesty could be corrupted. Law and order in the vineyard. As fraud spread, Bordeaux's parliament attempted to impose order. In 1737, a decree required that all barrels of wine exported from Bordeaux bear a branded mark indicating their origin. The idea was to reassure buyers and protect the region's reputation. But the counterfeiters were undeterred. They forged brands just as easily as they forged papers. For every law passed, new tricks emerged, adding elderberry juice to deepen color, mixing in brandy to mask acidity, or shipping wines from distant provinces under false Bordeaux labels. The fraud was so widespread that one British merchant remarked, "There is more Bordeaux in London than Bordeaux could ever produce." The human cost. Behind the fraud lay the desperation of small growers. In poor years, when harvests failed, peasants faced ruin. Selling grapes to counterfeiters provided a lifeline, even if it meant betraying the honor of Bordeaux. Dockworkers, too, were complicit. For a few sous, they siphoned and replaced wine under cover of night. Tavern keepers knowingly bought the counterfeit barrels, serving them to customers too drunk or indifferent to notice. It was a crime of quiet survival as much as greed. Each link in the chain profited a little, while the grand illusion continued. A merchant's fall. The most infamous case came in the 1770s, when a Bordeaux merchant named Jean-Baptiste Delmas was accused of masterminding a vast counterfeit scheme. Delmas, once a respected negotiant, had built a fortune shipping Bordeaux to London, Dublin, and Hamburg. But when a rival denounced him, inspectors raided his warehouses. They found barrels labeled as Lafite and Margaux but filled with mixtures of common Gascon wine. Seals were crudely imitated, papers forged. Delmas was tried for fraud, fined heavily, and stripped of his trading license. Yet his punishment was light compared to the scale of his deception. Within months, other merchants filled the void. Fraud was too profitable to disappear. An unresolved vintage. By the eve of the French Revolution, counterfeit wine had become so common that even Bordeaux's finest houses struggled to protect their reputations. Revolution and war disrupted trade further, making fraud both easier and harder to track. Travelers to Bordeaux often remarked on the irony. The region famed for its purity was drowning in imitation. The true victims were not the nobles who sipped false claret, but the honest growers whose legacy was tainted. And so, by the dawn of the 19th century, a bitter truth lingered in every glass. When the label could be forged and the taste disguised, how could anyone be certain what they were truly drinking? By the early 19th century, the problem of counterfeit Bordeaux had become so entrenched that even connoisseurs could no longer tell where the truth ended and deception began. Wine merchants, growers, and even foreign governments demanded action, but the fraudsters were always one step ahead. This section of the story is less about the grandeur of Bordeaux's vineyards and more about the hidden laboratories of deception, where poor vintages became great and mediocre wines were dressed in noble clothing. The science of counterfeit. Wine fraud in Bordeaux was not a matter of simply relabeling barrels. It was an art, honed over decades. Fraudsters developed a range of techniques, each designed to manipulate color, flavor, or strength. Coloring agents, elderberries, blackberries, or even boiled beetroot were added to deepen the hue of pale or diluted wines. In extreme cases, logwood or other chemical dyes were used, risking the health of unsuspecting drinkers. Fortification. Harsh, acidic wines from Cahors or Gascony were mixed with brandy or sugar to soften the taste. The result was richer on the tongue, mimicking the natural smoothness of Bordeaux's finest vintages. Blending, perhaps the most common trick. A small measure of genuine Bordeaux was mixed with vast quantities of cheap country wine, giving just enough aroma to deceive casual tasters. Resealing barrels. Dockworkers drilled small holes into genuine casks, siphoned out portions, and replaced them with inferior blends before resealing the staves. The forged brand still shone proudly on the barrel, but its contents told another story. Such practices blurred the boundary between fraud and custom. Many merchants argued blending was merely a commercial necessity. Others insisted it was outright deception. The line was thin, and profit made it thinner still. The inspectors of Bordeaux. Faced with growing complaints from abroad, Bordeaux's parliament and later the revolutionary authorities attempted to regulate the trade. Inspectors were appointed to examine barrels before export. Their task was daunting: to taste, to smell, to judge authenticity. But corruption was rife. Inspectors could be bribed with a few livers, or threatened with exclusion from the very merchants they were supposed to police. Some inspectors lacked the skill to discern subtle fraud, while others deliberately turned a blind eye. A famous anecdote tells of an inspector who, upon finding a barrel clearly adulterated, declared, "It is not good wine, but it is Bordeaux nonetheless." The remark revealed the futility of regulation in a system where deception had become normalized. The British Parliament speaks. In London, the fraud became a parliamentary matter. British importers, furious at being cheated, lobbied for stricter trade rules. Reports circulated that half the Bordeaux entering British ports was counterfeit, a mixture of Gascon, Spanish, and even German wines. One MP described it bitterly. "We are not drinking claret, we are drinking lies in a bottle." Yet despite the outrage, little changed. The demand for Bordeaux was too strong, and merchants on both sides of the channel profited too much to halt the flow. The honest growers fight back. For the true Chateaux Lafite, Margaux, Lador, Haut-Brion, the stakes were immense. Their names were currency, and every counterfeit barrel threatened to devalue them. Some estates began stamping their barrels with unique seals, harder to forge. Others insisted on sending trusted agents to oversee shipments personally. Still, the fraud persisted. Growers complained that they were not only battling weather and soil, but also invisible enemies in warehouses and docks. A poor vintage, once survivable, now risked being filled by fraudsters with fake Bordeaux that would later be blamed on the shade now. The frustration is captured in the words of one grower. "I till the soil, I wait upon heaven for sun and rain, and yet a thief in Bordeaux can undo it all with a ladle of Gascon wine." The case of the London wine merchant. One particularly notorious scandal erupted in 1816, when a London merchant named Thomas Harding was exposed for selling first growth Bordeaux that was anything but. Harding had imported barrels labeled Lafite and Margaux, charging his aristocratic clients exorbitant prices. But when a visiting French connoisseur tasted the wine at a dinner, he declared it a fraud, harsh, rustic, unmistakably Gascon. Harding was ruined, his reputation destroyed, but his clients faced humiliation as well. To serve counterfeit Bordeaux at a noble table was not merely a financial loss but a social disgrace. The Harding scandal spread across Britain, reinforcing suspicions that much of the Bordeaux trade was built on lies. Tricks of memory and palate. What made the fraud so effective was not only the tricks of merchants, but also the limitations of tasters. Even the most experienced palates could be deceived when wines were young, blended, or masked with sugar and brandy. And memories of vintages faded quickly. What tasted magnificent in Bordeaux might seem mediocre weeks later in London, after a rough sea voyage. Fraudsters exploited this uncertainty. If a customer complained, merchants could shrug and blame the voyage, the weather, or the fickleness of taste. Rarely could a buyer prove deliberate deception. The growing tension. By the 1820s, Bordeaux stood at a crossroads. Its reputation as the finest wine region in Europe was secure, but beneath that prestige lay rot. Fraud had become so common that many wondered whether true Bordeaux even existed outside a handful of elite tables. For ordinary drinkers, it hardly mattered. They raised glasses of counterfeit claret with no idea of its origin, their laughter lubricated by deception. But for the merchants and growers who depended on trust, the fraud gnawed at the very foundations of their trade. The tension was clear. Could Bordeaux protect its name, or would counterfeits forever drown its legacy in lies? By the mid-19th century, Bordeaux was still a name spoken with reverence at noble tables, but its honor had been scarred by decades of counterfeit. Fraud had not destroyed the region, but it had forced growers, merchants, and lawmakers to rethink how authenticity could be protected. The story of Bordeaux's forgotten vineyards is less about a single crime than about a long war of deception, and trust a battle fought not with swords, but with barrels and bottles. The push for reform. After repeated scandals in Britain, the pressure on Bordeaux mounted. Honest growers demanded stricter protections. Merchants, too, realized that unchecked fraud could eventually devalue even their profits. In 1855, a watershed moment arrived. At the request of Emperor Napoleon III, Bordeaux's wines were formally classified for the Exposition Universelle in Paris. The most prestigious estates were ranked into growths, crus, with Shady, Lafayette, Lador, Margaux, and Haut-Brion at the pinnacle. This system created a hierarchy of trust. Buyers could now distinguish between wines not just by region, but by reputation within Bordeaux itself. But even the classification, meant to protect authenticity, did not fully end fraud. Labels could be forged as easily as barrel brands. A counterfeit Lafayette might still appear in a London tavern, its false prestige swallowed with gusto by patrons who would never see the true vineyard. The birth of the bottle label. One of the most enduring responses to counterfeit came with the rise of bottling at the Shady. Traditionally, merchants bought wine in barrels and bottled it themselves, a system ripe for adulteration. By bottling at the source and sealing bottles with unique labels and corks, Chateaux reduced opportunities for fraud. This change transformed wine from a bulk commodity into a branded product. A label was more than decoration, it was a guarantee, a promise that what lay inside had not been diluted by unscrupulous hands. It also shifted power from merchants to growers. For centuries, negociants had controlled Bordeaux's trade, but bottling gave vineyards a way to reclaim ownership of their names. The forgotten vineyards. For lesser-known vineyards, however, the damage was lasting. While the great estates cemented their fame, many modest growers never recovered from the taint of fraud. Buyers abroad lumped them together with counterfeits, dismissing their wines as unreliable. Some vineyards were abandoned, others were absorbed into larger estates. These forgotten vineyards were the silent casualties of Bordeaux's age of deception. Their stories remain buried in parish records and shipping logs, their names erased by the fraud that drowned them. The broader impact. The counterfeit crisis of Bordeaux echoed far beyond France. It forced the entire European wine trade to grapple with authenticity. Italy, Spain, and Portugal faced similar problems, their names exploited by fraudsters. The Bordeaux experience became a cautionary tale, leading to broader movements for regulation and protection of origin. By the late 19th century, the concept of appellation began to take shape. The idea that a wine's identity was tied to its specific region and could be legally defended. Bordeaux's scars had paved the way for modern protections like the appellation d'origine contrôlée, AOC. Reflection, truth in the glass. The story of Bordeaux's counterfeit wines is not one of dramatic trials or sudden revelations, but of quiet corrosion. Fraud thrived because it was easy, profitable, and difficult to expose. It left behind no bloody corpses, only broken reputations and mistrust poured into glasses. And yet it also forced innovation. Bottling at the Shady, formal classification, and legal protections all arose because fraud made them necessary. Bordeaux's greatness, paradoxically, was forged in part by its deception. So the next time one raises a glass of Bordeaux, it carries not only the legacy of noble terroirs, but also the memory of centuries of fraud, struggle, and resilience. Because in the end, the lesson of Bordeaux's forgotten vineyards is simple. Wine is not just what fills the glass, it is the trust between grower and drinker. Without that trust, even the finest claret is only a counterfeit. Story 5. The Baker's Scales, a Tale of Fraud in Paris. In 18th century Paris, bread was not simply food, it was life itself. For the working poor, bread accounted for nearly 3/4 of daily calories. A laborer's family might eat little else, a crust in the morning, slices at midday, and more bread with a thin soup at night. The price and weight of bread determined whether families ate their fill or went hungry. It was no surprise, then, that bakers stood at the very heart of Parisian society. Their shops dotted every street, their ovens glowed before dawn, and their scales determined the fairness of daily life. But where there is trust, there is opportunity for betrayal. This is the story of how a simple set of scales tools meant to guarantee honesty became instruments of fraud, sparking outrage in the city and exposing the fragile balance between survival and deceit. Bread in the crown. By law, bakers in Paris were subject to strict regulation. The crown dictated the price of bread, adjusting it according to the cost of grain. Inspectors from the police or guilds visited bakeries regularly to ensure that loaves matched the official weight. If a loaf was light, it meant the baker was cheating customers and risking riots. Bread riots were not theoretical. They had erupted throughout the 17th and 18th centuries whenever prices rose or shortages struck. Authorities knew that tampering with bread was tampering with public order itself. A baker caught in fraud could face fines, imprisonment, even public humiliation with a loaf hung around his neck as he was marched through the streets. Yet despite the rules, fraud persisted. The fraudulent scales. The method was deceptively simple. A baker, instead of risking detection with visibly smaller loaves, might tamper with his scales. By weighting the beam slightly, by carving hollow spaces into counterweights, or by placing scales on uneven surfaces, he could cheat ounces from every transaction. To the eye, the loaf appeared the proper size. To the hand, it felt right. But day after day, the fraud accumulated. Families found their bread disappearing faster than their money, though they could not prove why. For poor Parisians, who lived always on the edge of hunger, those missing ounces meant the difference between a meal and an empty stomach. A whisper through the quarter. One of the most infamous cases emerged in the Faubourg Saint-Antoine, a working-class district where craftsmen, laborers, and apprentices lived crowded together. In 1768, rumors spread that a baker named Guillaume had been cheating his customers. His loaves, though golden and fragrant, seemed to shrink too quickly. Mothers complained that a loaf bought in the morning was gone by night, leaving their children still hungry. Word traveled quickly through the streets. Neighbors compared notes, weighing loaves against their own crude measures. Soon, suspicion hardened into certainty. Guillaume's scales were false. The inspection. The people of Saint-Antoine did not take such matters lightly. They petitioned the police to investigate. An inspector arrived at Guillaume's bakery one morning, accompanied by officers and a small crowd of angry customers. At first glance, the loaves appeared proper. Golden crusts dusted with flour lined the shelves. Guillaume protested his innocence, insisting he followed the law. But when the inspector placed the loaves on official guild scales, the truth emerged. Each was several ounces lighter than required. The inspector then examined Guillaume's own scales. The counterweights, seemingly made of solid iron, were revealed to be hollow, filled with lighter material. The fraud was undeniable. Outrage in the streets. The crowd outside erupted in fury. Shouts filled the street. "Thief, cheat, you starve our children." Some demanded that Guillaume be dragged to the pillory at once. Others called for his bakery to be destroyed. The police, fearing a riot, whisked him away for trial. His bakery was shuttered, and the hollow weights displayed publicly as evidence. For the people of Saint-Antoine, the case confirmed what they had long feared, that even those entrusted with their daily bread might betray them for profit. A trial of trust. At Guillaume's trial, testimony poured in. Mothers described children crying from hunger. Workers spoke of wages swallowed by shrinking loaves. One neighbor swore he had confronted Guillaume, only to be told that all bakers do the same. Guillaume, facing ruin, argued that he was a victim of circumstance. Grain prices had risen sharply, he said, and the crown's fixed bread prices left bakers unable to cover costs. If he had cheated, it was only to survive himself. The court was unmoved. Fraud in bread was too dangerous to tolerate. He was fined, stripped of his guild privileges, and paraded through the streets with a rotten loaf hung around his neck, a mark of shame for betraying the most basic trust of Parisian life. An unsettling truth. Yet the case raised troubling questions. Was Guillaume an isolated villain, or merely the one who had been caught? His claim that all bakers do the same echoed in the minds of Parisians. If true, then every loaf in Paris might be suspect, every baker complicit. And if bakers could not be trusted, what hope was there for the poor who depended on them? Was Guillaume a lone fraudster, or simply the face of a system already weighted against the people? The scandal in Saint-Antoine did not vanish with Guillaume's humiliation. Instead, it acted like a spark on dry straw, igniting a wave of suspicion across Paris. Whispers spread that bakers everywhere were shaving ounces from their loaves, hiding deception in plain sight. The police courts, already burdened with petty theft and disputes, began to receive a steady trickle of complaints. Our loaves are too small, the scales are wrong, the bakers are cheating us. What began as one man's disgrace soon revealed itself to be a problem, woven into the very fabric of the city's food supply. The bread police. Paris had long recognized the importance of bread. To maintain order, the monarchy established a system of police inspections dedicated to bakers. These inspectors, armed with official scales, toured bakeries unannounced, weighing loaves against the legal standard. In theory, this should have kept fraud in check. In practice, the inspectors were often overwhelmed. Paris boasted more than 1,000 bakeries, each producing hundreds of loaves daily. Corruption also seeped into the system. Inspectors could be bribed, distracted, or simply indifferent. The exposure of Guillaume's hollow weights embarrassed the police. If such fraud could go unnoticed for months, what else might be lurking in ovens and on scales across the city? Tricks of the trade. As investigators widened their inquiries, they uncovered an array of deceptive practices. Some were crude, others ingenious. Hollow weights. Just as Guillaume had used, these appeared solid but were secretly filled with lighter material. Shaved weights, scraped down bit by bit until they no longer balanced true. Counterfeit loaves. Bakers deliberately shaped loaves to look larger while using less dough, relying on crust and air to disguise the difference. Wet dough. Adding excess water to dough increased apparent weight before baking, leaving customers with smaller, denser bread once the water evaporated. Scale tilting. Placing scales on uneven counters or subtly altering the fulcrum so that balanced weights already favored the baker. Each trick on its own might shave only ounces, but multiplied across thousands of sales, they became fortunes stolen crumb by crumb from the poor. The people's fury. The people of Paris were not fools. They knew when their bread failed to satisfy. Each accusation against a baker carried the potential to spark unrest, especially in working-class neighborhoods already strained by rising costs of living. Bread riots had long haunted the authorities. In 1725, mobs stormed bakeries after rumors of hoarding. In 1750, angry crowds forced merchants to sell grain at just prices. The city's memory of such violence was fresh. Officials knew that widespread fraud, if unchecked, might again push Parisians into the streets. Thus, investigations into bakers were not merely about economics, they were about preventing revolution. The trials multiply. As more bakers were caught, the courts grew crowded with cases. Records from the Châtelet de Paris, the city's main court, show fines, suspensions, and public shamming ordered against fraudulent bakers. Punishments were deliberately theatrical. A dishonest baker might be forced to parade through the streets carrying his false weights. Others were locked in the pillory, where crowds jeered and pelted them with stale crusts. The symbolism was clear. Bread fraud was not a private crime, but a betrayal of the entire community. And yet, despite the trials, the fraud never fully ceased. Each punished baker only confirmed to the public what they already believed, that dishonesty was everywhere, hiding behind smiling faces and warm ovens. Bread and power. At the heart of the problem lay a contradiction. The monarchy fixed bread prices to prevent starvation, but this policy often squeezed bakers. When grain was scarce or costly, bakers could not raise prices. Their only options were to absorb the loss or cheat. Some argued that bakers were not villains but victims of the system. How can a man bake bread when grain costs more than he may charge? One guild member complained. Others, however, pointed out that many bakers grew rich through fraud, flaunting wealth while their neighbors tightened belts. The truth was likely both. Structural pressures created temptation, and greed supplied the rest. Bread trust and fear. By the late 1770s, bread fraud had become a specter haunting Paris. Ordinary citizens approached bakeries with suspicion, weighing loaves at home, comparing sizes with neighbors, and muttering about dishonest scales. Trust, once assumed, was now broken. The baker's shop, once the beating heart of community life, became a site of anxiety and resentment. And as the gap between rich and poor widened, bread took on a symbolic role, not just sustenance, but justice. If even bread could not be trusted, what faith could the people place in their rulers? Toward the boil. Authorities recognized the danger but struggled to contain it. Punishing bakers quelled anger temporarily, but new accusations always arose. Fraud was not merely the work of a few, it was systemic, inevitable in a city strained by regulation, poverty, and hunger. By the eve of the French Revolution, bread would become the rallying cry of the people. "Give us bread," shouted the crowds that marched on Versailles in 1789. The scandals of false scales and fraudulent loaves had already planted the seed. Bread was more than food, it was the measure of justice itself. An open question. The trials exposed the truth of fraud, but also revealed its inevitability. Could any system, no matter how strict, ensure honesty when survival was at stake? Or were the bakers simply scapegoats for deeper inequalities, punished for cheating a people already cheated by their rulers? Was bread fraud the crime of greedy bakers, or the symptom of a city where hunger itself was the greatest thief? As the 1780s dawned, Paris was restless. Prices rose steadily, wages lagged behind, and the poor found themselves spending nearly all they earned on bread. A bad harvest in 1788 triggered famine across France, and the cost of flour soared. In the streets of Paris, whispers spread again, not just of fraud in bakeries, but of hoarding by merchants, corruption among officials, and indifference in the palace. For the hungry, bread was no longer merely food. It was a symbol of justice denied. The crisis of 1789. The winter of 1788–1789 was one of the harshest in memory. Rivers froze, mills stood still, and transport collapsed. When the thaw came, grain prices reached historic highs. The Crown attempted to stabilize the situation, but its policies only deepened public anger. In April 1789, riots broke out near the Ravelin wallpaper factory in Paris. Though sparked by a rumor about wage cuts, the protest quickly turned into bread riots. Crowds stormed bakeries, seizing loaves and smashing scales. The baker's shop had become the battlefield of survival. Just months later, revolution erupted. On July 14, 1789, the storming of the Bastille became the iconic symbol, but it was hunger that filled the streets. The March of the Women. The most powerful reminder of bread's role came in October 1789, when thousands of women marched from Paris to Versailles. Their demand was simple: bread. Carrying pikes, knives, and even stolen cannons, they invaded the palace, confronting King Louis XVI and Queen Marie Antoinette. The queen, already despised, was remembered rightly or wrongly for the infamous phrase, "Let them eat cake." Whether she spoke the words or not, they captured the people's belief that the monarchy had no understanding of hunger. The royal family was forced to return to Paris, escorted by the mob, with carts of flour and bread following behind. The message was unmistakable. Power itself would be measured by bread. The fate of bakers. In this atmosphere, bakers found themselves caught between necessity and danger. To run a bakery in revolutionary Paris was to walk a razor's edge. If loaves were too small, accusations of fraud could spark violence. If prices rose, bakers were accused of hoarding or conspiracy. Some bakers were attacked outright, their shops looted by angry crowds. Others were hauled before revolutionary tribunals, accused of being enemies of the people. A profession once central to community life was transformed into a symbol of corruption and inequality. The fraudulent scales of men like Guillaume decades earlier were remembered not just as petty theft, but as the seeds of a larger betrayal. Bread was no longer just bread, it was a revolution in waiting. Bread as justice. In the revolution's rhetoric, bread became shorthand for justice. Pamphlets denounced the aristocracy for eating while the people starve. Revolutionary songs and speeches invoked bread alongside liberty and equality. The demand for just bread fused with demands for political reform until the two were inseparable. This connection was not lost on the authorities. New laws regulated bakeries more tightly than ever, demanding transparency, banning speculation, and enforcing fair prices. Inspectors now wielded not just the authority of the crown, but of the revolution itself. But the shadow of fraud never disappeared. Even under revolutionary fervor, whispers persisted that bakers trimmed loaves, tilted scales, or added fillers to dough. Hunger was too pervasive, temptation too strong, and trust too fragile to ever be fully restored. The long shadow. Looking back, the case of Guillaume's fraudulent scales might seem small, a few ounces stolen, a few families cheated. But in truth, it revealed something much larger, the fragility of trust in a society balanced on the edge of hunger. When bread was life, the baker's honesty was as important as the king's justice. And when bakers cheated, they were not merely stealing food, they were stealing faith in the system itself. That betrayal echoed in the streets, growing until it became revolution. Reflection. The story of the false scales reminds us that great upheavals are often born of small deceptions. A few ounces of flour stolen from a loaf could ripple outward, feeding anger, fueling mistrust, and eroding the bonds between people in power. And it raises a final, lingering question. Was it truly the bakers who broke the scales of justice, or was it the rulers of France, who left their people so close to hunger that even crumbs became cause for revolt? Story 6. The Midnight Bell Ringer Theft in a London Church. In the heart of 18th century London, tucked among twisting lanes and soot-stained walls, stood St. Dunstan in the east, a parish church that had weathered fire, rebuilding, and the endless press of the city. By day, its doors welcomed the faithful. By night, its tower bells tolled the hours, marking the city's restless passage through darkness. But in 1742, those bells marked something else. A string of thefts that would shake not only the parish, but also reveal the vulnerabilities of London's most sacred spaces. The sanctuary and the shadows. Churches in those years were not merely houses of prayer. They were community centers, courts of refuge, and sometimes banks of trust. Parishioners donated silver chalices, ornate candlesticks, and embroidered cloths, all of which were stored inside, believed safe under the watch of God and clergy. Yet sanctity was no guarantee against human greed. St. Dunstan's, like many churches, employed bell ringers and sextons who lived on the grounds. They were caretakers, guardians of the holy place, but proximity also brought temptation, and one among them, as it would turn out, succumbed. The first missing piece. The crime was discovered quietly. A verger preparing the altar for Sunday communion noticed that one silver flagon was missing. At first, it was assumed misplaced. Perhaps it had been lent to another parish or stored for safekeeping. Clergy combed through inventories, searching for clerical errors. But the truth could not be denied for long. When a second vessel vanished weeks later, suspicions hardened. Someone was stealing from within the church itself. The thought was chilling, that theft could flourish not in the alleys or taverns of London, but in the very sanctuary where people knelt to pray. The ringers under suspicion. Attention turned quickly to the bell ringers. These men, often young and poorly paid, worked odd hours, ringing for funerals, weddings, and the marking of days. They had access to the tower, to the vestry, and to the locked chests where valuables were stored. One in particular drew notice: Thomas Carter, a wiry man with a nervous smile. He had recently come into money, buying new clothes and frequenting alehouses with unusual generosity. To some, he explained that a relative had left him a small inheritance. To others, he boasted of good fortune ringing bells. Rumor moved faster than proof, but soon Carter's name was whispered in every pew. The investigation begins. Unlike modern times, 18th century London had no centralized police force. Parish crimes were investigated by constables, beadles, and sometimes hired watchmen. In St. Dunstan's case, the churchwardens launched their own inquiry. They began by auditing the church's treasures. The results were grim. Not one or two, but a dozen pieces of silver were missing: chalices, plates, spoons, and even a paten used for communion. The theft had not been opportunistic but systematic, carried out over months. The evidence pointed inward. Someone with regular access had been quietly stripping the church of its wealth. The midnight bell. Then came the night that suspicion hardened into certainty. A neighbor reported seeing Carter leave the church tower after midnight, carrying a sack. The bell ropes had been pulled at odd hours, ringing out a strange and lonely toll that no service required. It was as if Carter had been signaling his own crime, each toll masking the clink of silver slipping into his sack. The wardens decided they could wait no longer. They arranged for constables to watch the church the following night. The trap is set. On a cold February evening, the men hid among the shadows of the churchyard. Hours passed in silence until, near midnight, the bells stirred. A single, low toll echoed through the night air, then another. The watchers saw him, Carter, slipping from the vestry with a lantern in one hand and a small chest in the other. His sack bulged with stolen goods. The constables rushed forward, seizing him before he could flee. The chest burst open, spilling silver across the cobblestones. In the dim glow of lanterns, the church's lost treasures gleamed like fallen stars. A city reacts. News spread quickly. To steal from a church was not simply theft, it was sacrilege. For Londoners, it was proof that even sacred spaces were vulnerable, that sin lurked not only in brothels and taverns, but in the very places that promised refuge. Crowds gathered outside St. Dunstan's, murmuring about the betrayal. Mothers scolded children that dishonesty would lead them to Carter's fate. Sermons thundered about greed, temptation, and the dangers of failing to fear God. The crime was no longer just Carter's, it was a parable for the entire parish. An unanswered question. As Carter sat in irons awaiting trial, one question haunted the wardens. How had he managed to carry on his thefts for so long? Were others complicit, turning a blind eye as he plundered the church? Or was the trust placed in caretakers itself the flaw, a system that assumed sanctity could guard against temptation? Was Carter a lone sinner, or simply the one caught in a city where even faith could not shield silver from hungry hands? When Thomas Carter was arrested outside St. Dunstan, with stolen silver tumbling from his sack, the parish thought the case was over. But in 18th century London, justice was never so simple. The trial that followed revealed not only the fate of a single bell ringer, but the anxieties of an entire city about crime, punishment, and the sanctity of its institutions. The jail. Carter was taken first to Poultry-Compteur, a small and notoriously foul city prison, before being transferred to Newgate. Newgate in 1742 was a place of chaos. Debtors mingled with thieves, prostitutes with murderers. Prisoners bribed jailers for ale and meat, or else starved in dark, stinking cells. There Carter waited, his name spreading through the city. To some, he was a sinner destined for the rope. To others, his tale was one more example of London's corruption, where even churchmen's assistants were thieves. Public interest. The theft from St. Dunstan's attracted attention beyond the parish. Pamphlets were printed, recounting the case in lurid detail. Ballads were sung in taverns, mocking the bell ringer who rang for silver, not for God. The crime was more than scandal, it was entertainment for a public hungry for stories of sin and downfall. Yet beneath the humor lay unease. If a bell ringer could strip a church of its wealth undetected, what did that say about the trustworthiness of servants, apprentices, or even clergy? How safe were London's thousands of parish treasures? The Old Bailey. In March 1742, Carter was brought before the Old Bailey, London's central criminal court. Trials there were swift, often lasting no more than an hour. The courtroom, lit by flickering candles, was crowded with onlookers, curious citizens, parish members, and petty thieves eager to learn from another's misfortune. The charge was clear: theft of church property, a crime of sacrilege. Witnesses testified, including the constables who had caught him with the stolen chest. The verger swore under oath that silver chalices and vessels had been missing for months, and that Carter had both access and opportunity. Carter's defense. Carter attempted a defense, claiming he had been framed by jealous fellow ringers. He insisted the sack was not his, that he had merely stumbled upon it in the churchyard. His words, however, rang hollow against the testimony of those who had seen him leave the vestry chest in hand. Moreover, Carter's sudden wealth in previous months, his new coat, his drinking in alehouses was recounted by witnesses. The jury did not take long to weigh his words against the evidence. The verdict. Carter was found guilty. The judge, robed in scarlet and white, pronounced the sentence with grim finality: death by hanging. In that era, the theft of property worth more than a shilling could carry the death penalty, and Carter's theft of church silver far exceeded that threshold. The congregation of St. Dunstan's, watching in silence, may have felt satisfaction that justice was served. But for many in the city, another question stirred. Was hanging truly justice for theft, even theft from a church? The spectacle of punishment. Carter was returned to Newgate to await execution at Tyburn. On the appointed day, he was paraded through the streets on a cart, the infamous Tyburn journey. Crowds lined the way, jeering, praying, or silently reflecting on the fate of a man who had once tolled the bells of faith and now awaited the toll of the hangman's rope. At Tyburn, where gallows loomed like a grim monument, Carter gave a brief speech. He admitted guilt, asking forgiveness from God and his parish. Some said his final words were bitter, that he blamed poverty and poor wages for his fall. Others swore he accepted his fate with repentance. The noose tightened, the cart rolled away, and Thomas Carter joined the thousands who had met their end beneath Tyburn's tree. Aftermath in the parish. Back at St. Dunstan's, Carter's execution was both relief and warning. The stolen silver, much of it recovered, was returned to the altar. Sermons thundered about sin and temptation, warning that even those entrusted with holy duties could fall prey to greed. The other bell ringers were kept under stricter watch, and the vestry instituted new rules. Inventories were to be checked monthly, valuables locked in stronger chests, and multiple keys required for access. Trust alone was no longer sufficient safeguard. The larger question. Yet the case raised a troubling point for Londoners. Was Carter's crime unique, or was it simply the one exposed? Churches across the city held treasures far richer than St. Dunstan's. How many other parishes had suffered quiet thefts, their losses masked by clerical oversight or covered up to avoid scandal? And deeper still, one could ask, was Carter's crime the product of a singular greedy man, or the symptom of a society where poverty pressed men to desperate acts, even in the shadow of God's altar? If hunger and want drove a bell ringer to betrayal, could the gallows truly silence the causes of theft, or only the thief himself? The execution of Thomas Carter at Tyburn was not the end of the story. For the people of London, and especially for those within St. Dunstan's parish, his crime became a parable that lived on for decades. The theft of silver from God's house, the betrayal of trust by a church servant, and the public spectacle of punishment resonated far beyond the gallows. The parish aftermath. In the months following Carter's hanging, St. Dunstan's parishioners lived under a shadow of suspicion. Though Carter had been executed, whispers lingered. Were others complicit? Some suggested that fellow bell ringers must have noticed his actions. Others wondered whether clergy had turned a blind eye, unwilling to admit the sanctuary could be breached. The church responded by tightening control. Vestry records show the appointment of new wardens specifically tasked with monitoring parish treasures. Lockboxes were reinforced with iron, and keys divided among 3 men to prevent solitary access. Even the humble candlesticks were inventoried with meticulous detail. Faith remained strong, but trust had been reshaped. Sacred space was still revered but no longer assumed impregnable. London's anxiety. Carter's crime was not isolated. Reports soon surfaced of thefts from other churches across London: silver stolen from St. Bride's, linen stripped from St. Mary, and even brasses pried from tombs. These crimes seemed to confirm a troubling reality. Churches, long seen as sanctuaries, were not immune to the wave of urban crime sweeping the capital. As London grew, its population pushing towards 700,000, the city's wealth was unevenly spread. Poverty in rookeries and slums pressed against the wealth of merchants and clergy. Churches, filled with precious objects and lightly guarded, offered irresistible temptation. Carter became the face of this unease. His story was repeated in pamphlets, sermons, and moral tracts as a warning about greed, betrayal, and the danger of leaving holy treasures unguarded. Moral lessons and public perception. For preachers, Carter's fall was proof of sin's reach. Sermons thundered that no man, however close to the altar, was immune to temptation. His theft was framed not merely as a crime against property, but as a violation of divine trust. Parishioners were urged to look inward, to guard their souls against covetousness, just as wardens now guarded chalices. But among ordinary Londoners, the lesson was more complicated. Some pitied Carter, seeing in him a man crushed by poverty who sought relief in stolen silver. Others mocked him in ballads and street rhymes, turning his betrayal into entertainment. And still others asked a darker question. If the gallows awaited for thefts born of hunger, what hope was there for the poor of London? The legacy of church theft. In the decades that followed, Carter's case became part of a broader movement toward greater security and stricter punishment. Many churches began hiring watchmen or locking their doors overnight. Wealthier parishes built vaults beneath their chancels for valuables, echoing the practices of merchants protecting gold. At the same time, debates stirred about the severity of punishment. Hanging for theft, especially from the church, was justified by some as protecting the sanctity of faith. But others argued that gallows did little to address the root causes: poverty, inequality, and desperation. By the end of the 18th century, with the rise of reform movements, Carter's case was sometimes invoked as an example of how harsh penalties failed to deter crime. After all, the city's gallows had swung endlessly, yet theft continued. Echoes of the bells. For those who had lived through it, however, the most lasting image was not of Tyburn but of the midnight bells. Parishioners recalled lying awake, hearing the toll of ropes pulled at odd hours, not for prayer but for plunder. Those sounds blurred the line between sacred duty and betrayal, echoing a truth London struggled to face. Crime could seep even into the heart of holiness. Carter's betrayal forced Londoners to accept that trust could no longer be taken for granted. Locks, vigilance, and suspicion had become the guardians of faith's treasures. Reflection. When you consider Thomas Carter's fate, it is tempting to see him simply as a villain, a thief who stole from God's house. But look closer, and his story reveals something broader: the fragile balance between trust and temptation, faith and security, poverty and punishment. The bells of St. Dunstan still tolled after Carter's death, marking hours, funerals, and festivals. Yet for years, when Londoners heard their sound, they could not help but remember the midnight ringer who turned sacred duty into sacrilege. And so we are left with a haunting question. Was Carter's crime the failure of one man, or the failure of a society that left desperation and greed to echo louder than the bells themselves? Story 7. The disputed will and inheritance fraud in rural England. In the summer of 1821, the village of Withercombe in Devon seemed untouched by the turbulence of the wider world. It was a place of hedgerows and sheepfolds, where gossip carried farther than cartwheels, and where everyone knew who was plowing what field, or who was courting whose daughter. It was here that an inheritance scandal, quiet in its beginnings, violent in its consequences, would unfold. The death of a farmer. John Hatherley, a farmer of 62, had lived all his life in Withercombe. His land was modest, perhaps 30 acres of workable soil, but in a rural parish it was wealth enough to grant security and respect. His children, however, were few. Only one legitimate daughter, Mary, survived into adulthood, and she had long been married to a wheelwright in Exeter. When John Hatherley died one June evening after a sudden seizure in his fields, the parish turned its attention not to grief, but to the question of inheritance. Who would take the farm, the cottages, the cattle? In rural England, land was power, and even the smallest plot could provoke disputes that split families for generations. The will emerges. Within a week of his death, a document was produced, the last will and testament of John Hatherley. It was said to leave the entire estate not to his distant daughter Mary, but to a young man named William Carter, a nephew by marriage, barely 25, known more for his debts in nearby market towns than for any skill with land. The will shocked the villagers. Farmer Hatherley had rarely spoken kindly of William, once calling him a feather-brained fool who'd sooner gamble than sow. Why, then, would he leave him the farm? The document bore John's shaky signature, witnessed by 2 men from a neighboring parish. Rumors began at once. Was the will forged? Was William taking advantage of a dying man? Or worse, had Hatherley been helped to his grave? Suspicion in the village. Mary, the daughter, returned from Exeter upon hearing the news. To her, the will was an outrage. She claimed her father had promised her the farm years ago. She insisted he had been in no condition to write, let alone sign, a legal document in his final weeks. The village divided swiftly. Some believed Mary, pointing out the improbability of John disinheriting his only child. Others, whether out of fear of William's temper or hope of currying favor with the new landowner, defended the will as lawful. The parish rector tried to remain neutral, but even he confessed doubts. In a letter to the bishop, he wrote that John was failing in both mind and hand in the last weeks of his life, making the appearance of a crisp new will highly questionable. The forging trade. Forgery was not uncommon in the early 19th century. With property at stake, unscrupulous men and women sometimes manufactured wills, deeds, and signatures. Courts were filled with cases of forged inheritance documents, and penalties were harsh transportation to Australia or even death. for those convicted. What made the Hatherley case unusual was its setting. In a rural parish, where everyone knew each other's business, forging a will was riskier than in London. But William Carter seemed willing to gamble. He hired lawyers in Exeter, filed the will with the probate court, and prepared to take possession of the farm. Mary's challenge. Mary refused to accept defeat. Despite the cost, she hired her own solicitor and contested the will. Her case rested on two pillars: her father's declining health and William's long record of dishonesty. She claimed the signature on the will bore irregularities, letters shaped differently than her father's usual hand. She also pointed out that the witnesses were not local, but strangers from another parish, likely bribed by William. The court agreed to hear her case. For Withercombe, it was a spectacle unlike any seen before. A village matter dragged into the world of lawyers, judges, and legal precedent. Neighbors whispered in alehouses, speculating not just about the truth, but about who might profit depending on the verdict. A deeper shadow. As the case unfolded, darker rumors began to circulate. Some claimed William had visited Farmer Hatherley on the very day of his seizure. Others swore they saw William handling documents at the old man's bedside. A few even muttered that John's death had not been natural, that his decline had been hastened by something slipped into his cider. Though no evidence surfaced to prove foul play, the whispers clung to William like burrs. His arrogance and sudden claims of ownership only fueled suspicion. The case was no longer about inheritance alone. It was about morality, trust, and the question that gnawed at the villagers. Had greed not only stolen the farm, but also the farmer's life? A tense pause. The Exeter court adjourned the first hearings, postponing its verdict until further evidence could be gathered. Mary returned to Withercombe, still fighting, while William strutted about the parish as though victory were already his. The villagers lived in uneasy suspension, waiting to see who would prevail. Behind every hedge and gate, the question lingered. Was this simply a family dispute over land, or the exposure of a calculated fraud, written in ink but rooted in betrayal? If a man could steal a farm with a forged will, how far might ambition go in twisting law, family, and death itself? When the matter of John Hatherley's will reached the Exeter Assizes in the autumn of 1821, the atmosphere was charged with anticipation. For the city, it was one more dispute among many that crowded the dockets. But for the small village of Withercombe, it was nothing less than a trial of truth and reputation. The outcome would decide not only the fate of 30 acres of farmland, but the legacy of a man who had lived his whole life under the Devon sky. The courtroom. The court was held in the Grand Hall of Exeter Castle, a place that carried centuries of judgments, some ending in transport ships, others at the gallows. Wooden benches creaked under the weight of onlookers, many of whom had traveled miles simply to witness the drama of a rural family tearing itself apart. Mary Hatherley sat with her solicitor, her face pale but steady. William Carter arrived in a tailored coat, trying to exude the air of a rightful landowner, though his swagger carried more of a gambler than a gentleman. Between them lay the contested will, its ink still dark, its words stark in their implications. Mary's case. Mary's solicitor began with the most direct argument, that John Hatherley had been too infirm to produce a valid will. Witnesses from Withercombe spoke of his decline, how he struggled to hold a quill, how his speech faltered in his final days. One farmer described visiting John a week before his death, noting that the old man's hand shook so he could scarce lift a spoon. Then came the matter of the signature. Mary produced letters and leases signed by her father over decades, each neat and firm, even in old age. The will's signature, by contrast, was jagged, the letters malformed. An Exeter scrivener testified that it bore the marks of tracing, as though someone had guided or forced the pen. The witnesses to the will were also scrutinized. Neither man lived in Withercombe. One was a clerk from Exeter, the other a tradesman with no known connection to John. Under questioning, they admitted to being asked a favor by William, though they denied knowledge of any fraud. The case seemed to strengthen Mary's claim that the will was not her father's true intention, but a construction engineered to deprive her of her inheritance. William's defense. William's solicitor struck back with vehemence. He argued that John, though aged, had been of sound mind and fully entitled to change his will. He painted Mary as a distant daughter, living in Exeter, rarely visiting her father and caring more for her own household than for the family farm. By contrast, William was presented as the dutiful nephew, often present in Withercombe and trusted with errands and estate matters. As for the shaky signature, William's lawyer claimed it was simply the mark of a dying man. "The hand weakens before the mind," he declared, insisting that the law recognized imperfect signatures so long as intent was clear. The courtroom bristled with the contrast. Mary's appeal to handwriting, witness irregularities, and filial promises versus William's appeal to proximity, practicality, and the supposed natural choice of an heir more capable of farming. Seeds of doubt. But as the case stretched into its second week, troubling details emerged. A neighbor testified that William had been seen with blank papers at John's bedside. Another recalled hearing raised voices between uncle and nephew only days before the seizure that killed John. Most damning was the testimony of a Withercombe laborer who claimed William boasted in a tavern, weeks before the death, that the farm would be mine, no matter what the old man said. The defense dismissed this as drunken chatter, but the words hung in the air, stubborn and incriminating. Whispers of darker deeds spread through the public benches. Some spectators muttered that William had hastened John's end, though no proof was presented. Still, the shadow of possible foul play made the case more than a civil dispute. It became a moral trial of character and trust. The court's dilemma. The judges faced a dilemma. On one hand, the will existed, bearing a signature, witnessed and filed correctly. On the other, substantial doubt had been raised about its authenticity, the health of the testator, and the integrity of the beneficiary. Forgery cases were notoriously difficult. Courts hesitated to declare a will invalid without ironclad proof, lest they undermine the sanctity of written documents. Yet the credibility of William Carter was eroding daily, while Mary's persistence earned sympathy. By the second adjournment, both sides sensed the stakes had grown beyond inheritance. If William were exposed as a forger, he faced not merely the loss of land but criminal charges, with transportation or worse awaiting him. Mary, meanwhile, risked ruinous costs if the court upheld the will against her. The village watches. Back in Withercombe, the villagers lived in a state of tense expectation. Every cart from Exeter brought news, another testimony, another rumor. Alehouses buzzed with speculation. Was the law strong enough to pierce a forged document, or would William's boldness and resources carry the day? Mary's supporters prayed for justice, fearing that power and deception might outweigh truth. William's few allies, mostly creditors hopping to profit from his victory, urged patience, though even they muttered uneasily about the mounting evidence. The farm itself lay quiet, its fields untended, its future suspended. Sheep grazed on unharvested grass while men argued in a distant courtroom. A darker question. The hearings closed with no immediate verdict. The judges announced they would deliberate further, promising a decision within weeks. Both parties returned to their lodgings, one clinging to law, the other to hope. Yet even as the case paused, a darker question gnawed at Withercombe. Was this merely a contest over inheritance, or was it the exposure of a deeper crime? Had William Carter not only forged a will, but engineered the death of the man who stood between him and the land? If the will was forged, would the truth emerge in time, or would the soil of Withercombe be claimed forever by deceit? The weeks of waiting stretched heavily over Withercombe and Exeter alike. For Mary, each day brought renewed anxiety. For William, it was a time of strained bravado. The judge's decision would determine whether the farm remained the inheritance of a devoted daughter or passed into the hands of a nephew whose reputation now teetered on the edge of ruin. The verdict at Exeter. On a cold November morning in 1821, the judges reconvened. The courtroom was crowded again, parishioners, farmers, curious townsfolk, all eager to hear whether law would side with Mary or William. The Chief Justice began by acknowledging the difficulty of the case. A will was, in English law, a sacred expression of a man's final wishes, not to be overturned lightly. Yet, he declared, a will must also bear the hallmarks of authenticity, free of suspicion and coercion. The judges reviewed the evidence in measured tones. John's feebleness in his last days, the uncharacteristic witnesses, the discrepancies in the handwriting, and the tavern boasts attributed to William. After deliberation, they pronounced their decision. The will was invalid. The estate was to pass to Mary as John's natural and rightful heir. A murmur swept the hall, some gasps, some cheers, a few muttered curses. Mary bowed her head, tears spilling as relief overcame restraint. William's face, flushed with anger, betrayed not only disappointment but fear. William's fall. The invalidation of the will was only the beginning. The court ordered an inquiry into William Carter's actions, particularly the possibility of forgery. Within weeks, he was indicted. The handwriting expert's testimony, combined with witness accounts of his presence with blank papers, weighed heavily against him. At trial the following spring, William was found guilty of attempting to defraud the rightful heir through forgery of a testamentary document. His sentence was transportation for 14 years to Van Diemen's Land, modern Tasmania. For Withercombe, the news struck like thunder. A man once known for his charm and ambition was now branded a criminal, cast from the village in chains. His name became a cautionary tale, whispered whenever talk of greed or inheritance arose. Mary's restoration. Mary, now the confirmed owner of her father's estate, returned to Withercombe with a mix of triumph and burden. Her fight for justice had cost her dearly months of legal expense, the wear of public scrutiny, and the bitter knowledge that kinship could be twisted into betrayal. Yet she set about restoring the farm with determination. Tenants were rehired, fields plowed, and the village reassured that stability had returned. Parish records note her as a benefactor in the years that followed, donating to the church and sponsoring repairs to cottages damaged in winter storms. Her victory was not simply personal, it was seen by many as proof that persistence, truth, and careful scrutiny could overcome deception, even when cloaked in the authority of a written will. A lasting legacy. The Hatherley case left a mark not only on Withercombe, but on wider discussions about inheritance law. Newspapers seized upon the story, reporting it as an example of the dangers of forgery and the need for stricter oversight of wills. Legal scholars debated whether the process of witnessing should be more tightly regulated to prevent imported strangers from attesting signatures. In Devon's countryside, the story was retold for generations. It became a parable about greed, the fragility of trust, and the endurance of justice when pursued with patience. Parents warned children of William Carter's fate, how ambition, when corrupted by deceit, could end not in prosperity but in exile.